Nostalgia. A word that decrepit old men like me fear because it can dismiss any positive opinion we have of the past. This once wistful noun that characterized a bittersweet longing for that which time has worn away, now simply means to be blinded by childhood ignorance and rose-tinted glasses. Yet it can also undeniably be a poison to one's memory, shifting perception of the past into believing it was something that it was not. I don't know when it was that I began to resent Star Fox 64, but I know that at some point, I got the impression that it had diluted the purity of the Super Nintendo original I had loved and adored. I think I saw how the following games, such as Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assault, strayed further and further from the arcade action that I felt defined the original release, and I chose to blame Star Fox 64 since it had introduced such alternate vehicles as the Landmaster and Blue Marine, and the less arcade-style all-range mode. That's where it all started to go wrong, I suppose I told myself. Looking back though, I have to wonder, did I always hate Star Fox 64? I didn't own the Nintendo 64 system myself, and so I had only gotten to play the game when my friend had brought his console and games over. Even then, we primarily fought each other in the competitive multiplayer mode rather than spending much time in the campaign. To that end, did I even know what Star Fox 64 was like? Or was I just making assumptions? With the announcement of the Switch 2 remake and, if we're being honest, reboot, I decided it was time to take an honest look back at both the Super Nintendo original and the N64 follow-up, to both see if that first game I have such fond memories of aged like fine wine or a dead fish, and if I had perhaps been too harsh on Star Fox 64 and ought to give it a fair shake. I won't simply be doing a lazy critique of both games, however. I want to take a look back at the era in which these games were released in order to try and illustrate why such simple graphics could make such a big splash. Pump up your Reeboks, we're going back to the early 1990s.
The big hit of the show is Star Fox, the first game using the Super FX chip for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
Nintendo also launched its most powerful game technology ever using the new Super FX chip. This is a RISC processor built into each game cartridge that offers texture mapping, light source shading, object rotation and scaling, and 3D polygon animation.
The Super FX processor is a custom-made RISC processor. We spent 2 years in the development on it and basically developed that and the game Star Fox at the same time, so they sort of worked off of each other.
The first cartridge of Nintendo's new Star Fox game. Star Fox is a flight of fantasy set in an action-packed science fiction world. Nintendo says the effects are so real, players will swear they're actually flying the spacecraft.
Today, Nintendo shipped out more than 1 million cartridges of its newest video game called Star Fox, designed to give the player the feeling of piloting a supersonic speed aircraft with three-dimensional graphics and blazing game speed. The cost $59.95.
33 years ago, Star Fox was state-of-the-art. However, I want to make sure it is clear that it was not the first 3D game, nor the first game of its type. It was, however, not only the first to make a real mark, but a technological feat that it had managed to work on a system such as the Super Nintendo in the first place. Most gray-bearded gamers and gaming historians will no doubt remember Battlezone, a 1980 Atari arcade game that utilized wireframes and vector graphics to achieve its 3D, first-person combat perspective. In 1991, Namco released Starblade and Solvaloo into Japanese arcades. These games would prove to be influential to the developers at Argonaut Software, but before that, they were making waves of their own with their Starglider and Starglider 2 titles on home computers such as the Amiga. The scrappy young coders then chose to hack an original Nintendo Entertainment System and Game Boy in order to program 3D rendered graphics onto the limited 8-bit hardware, and then sent those demos over to Nintendo as a pitch to develop games for their consoles. This move led Nintendo to approaching Argonaut to team up and develop the Super FX chip, a graphics processor that would be plugged into the board inside the gaming cartridge, and enable the Super Nintendo to render actual 3D polygonal graphics instead of the sprite trickery of Mode 7, which is what enabled games like F-Zero and Mario Kart to imitate that three-dimensional gameplay. Technology in the 90s was advancing at lightning speeds, however, and so was the competition from upstart Sega. While the Master System and Genesis had been in the United States since the mid to late 80s, they failed to get a foothold compared to the Nintendo juggernaut. That is, until the North American marketing team started to throw hands at their television advertisements, the Blue Blur Sonic proved to be a rival whose attitude could outshine a mustachioed plumber, and the blast processing capabilities of the Genesis were embellished to the point of fabrication. In addition, there were factions within Sony chomping at the bit to leap into the video game market with CD-ROM technology, and Atari was looking to reclaim their throne with the 64-bit Atari Jaguar. So, with their market share in the United States waning, and additional threats bearing their fangs as they circled the current alpha predator, Nintendo wanted to put out something that not only sounded sleek, but looked the part too. Enter the Super FX chip, with Star Fox as the flagship product to sell the idea. Premiering at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in early 1993 in Las Vegas, it was the first noteworthy polygonal 3D game you could play on a home console in your living room. Most of all, it didn't require the purchase of a new expensive peripheral add-on or a brand new console. This was an especially vicious blow to Sega, whose expensive 32X and Sega CD add-ons either couldn't render true 3D, or wouldn't have anything resembling such tech until the following year, when both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation would launch in Japan and make the hardware peripherals look like costly fossils. This meant Star Fox, and Nintendo's new chip, promised consumers that they could get this advanced technology before anyone else offered it, without having to purchase any new hardware or peripherals, just the game cartridge. Additionally, while id Software was making headway in the 3D gaming space on personal computers, very few consumers actually owned a PC at home, and there weren't dedicated graphics cards to push the power of the PC significantly beyond the console. Doom would launch in December of that year, but it was still using sprites for monsters and guns. Which isn't to say that Doom itself wasn't impressive. In fact, I would argue Doom was even more important in the long run than Star Fox ultimately would be, due to the influence it would have in pushing Microsoft to take gaming on PCs seriously, not to mention the push and demand for dedicated graphics cards by the mid to late 90s. Back then, however, we didn't have hindsight to tell us what was and wasn't going to be important. Star Fox was huge, and Nintendo had dedicated more space to it on their Consumer Electronics Show floor than any other title in 1993. They wanted retailers and press to walk away believing the hype, that this was the future, and that Fox McCloud was going to join the ranks of Mario, Link, and Samus as an iconic character for years to come. When magazines hit newsstands and the checkout aisles of the grocery stores, the pages were practically gushing with praise and adoration for the game and Nintendo's Super FX chip. Nintendo dropped TV advertisements to encourage kids to nag their parents to purchase the game. Nintendo Power even included a monthly comic to spark interest in its audience. Speaking personally, I tried for at least 2 months, if not 3, to rent the game from the different video rental stores in our area. Everywhere I went, Star Fox was rented out, hogged by whichever customers were fortunate enough to beat me to the store week after week. It wasn't until my 8th birthday that June that I got to own a copy for myself, and it soon became one of my most played cartridges for the system. Star Fox would become one of my favorite games, yet another bullet in the chamber for my war against Sega in the console wars at the time, and when I swung on the playground swings at school with my friend, we'd often pretend we were Fox and Falco shooting down the evil forces of Venom. Star Fox was a pretty huge deal, but it's also pretty clear it hasn't remained a big deal. So, I suppose the question is, were we all fooled by what seemed to be state-of-the-art graphics and spectacle? Or was there actually a solid game in that high-tech cartridge?
Come in, Cornelia.
This is Cornelia, Pepper speaking. Congratulations on a job well done.
I don't like the idea of dismissing something simply because it looks old or looks cheap in comparison to modern technology or conventions. Everyone has their limitations, admittedly, but it's like dismissing a black and white movie simply because it isn't in color. It doesn't matter that The Maltese Falcon or All About Eve have dialogue and wit that outclasses the vast majority of movies today. They may be dismissed because the lack of color would be perceived as boring, for example. Simultaneously, it doesn't matter to me that you can tell the xenomorph in the original Alien is a man in a suit. It's still one of the best and most effective horror films ever made. Limitation breeds creativity, and was only because the animatronic shark kept breaking down that Steven Spielberg hid the aquatic carnivore for most of Jaws, an incidental decision that would become a tried and true technique to build tension and anticipation of a movie's monster. Now, Star Fox is a bit of a different case, as video games are both entertainment and technology, and while good writing, acting, and cinematography are timeless, technology can become obsolete. Nonetheless, when I look at Star Fox, I don't see what it lacks in graphical detail, but what Nintendo managed to accomplish by working around limitations. Take, for example, the white dots along the ground. They are primarily included to create a sense of speed and forward momentum to the player, as without them, everything would no doubt appear to move more slowly. They even had little white dots in the outer space segments that move from the center screen to the outer edge, as if they were stars speeding by as the player flew forward. These are small details that subconsciously convey that sense of forward momentum to the player, but they make a big difference to the feel of the game. Moreover, as simple and abstract as these 3D models are, they each have a unique silhouette from one another. Nintendo's artists worked with Argonaut's programmers to ensure that every vessel had a clear, distinct look. This feeds back into the gameplay, as different ships will have different behavioral patterns from one another, be it the pace and timing of when they fire their weapons, what kind of projectiles they fire, the formations in which they fly or whether they head straight for the player, and so on. This means a player can recognize an enemy and think, oh, I need to get rid of them, they're going to fly right towards me. Or, oh, I want to start doing the barrel roll to deflect their incoming fire, as they're going to just shower me with plasma. What makes an action game interesting is moment-to-moment decision making, and the variety of enemies and enemy behaviors they came up with despite having a limited amount of polygons available means players will always be pressured to think quickly or be dead. While Shigeru Miyamoto and team did not want Star Fox to be perceived as a typical shoot-'em-up type of game, especially as the genre was considered a dying breed at the time, they still implemented that arcade-style action through power-ups, score attacks, and fast-paced action. Of course, many of these power-ups won't appear unless the player performs specific stunts or actions. The most famous of these examples is flying through the different arches of Corneria. If you successfully soar through each one, the first Twin Blaster upgrade will be made available. Such secrets and gems will be hidden throughout the rest of the game, including flying through asteroid formations or even defeating certain enemies. In addition to enemy vessels, obstacles and space debris will be flung into the player's path as well. Different planets will have a variety of rock formations and barriers that you'll have to evade, or mysterious floating structures such as in Sector X and Z, or the amoeba that'll stick to your R-Wing in Sector Y. This creates an additional factor to the previously mentioned enemy formations and attack patterns, where players will have to swiftly decide how to evade both enemy fire and obstacles ahead while shooting down their foes, and even occasionally chasing a difficult to obtain power-up. As I said, one of the ingredients to a good action game is the number of decisions a player must make in quick succession and while under pressure. What is, perhaps, one of the most easily overlooked features from a modern lens is the cinematic presentation of the game. Inspired by the likes of Star Wars and Thunderbirds in regards to tone and style, one of the reasons I imitated Fox and Falco with my friend on that playground was because Star Fox allowed me to feel like I was a pilot in an epic sci-fi shootout like no other console game before it. In an old interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, he explained that most console games at the time were like a stage play. The audience sat back in their seats as the story played out on a flat plane. With Star Fox, they were able to more freely move the camera around like a film due to the polygonal graphics and true 3D environment. There are a handful of moments the player can see this, such as the initial scramble at the start of each new game. You can also see this after destroying the capital ship in Space Armada or destroying Andros on Venom, where the explosion dramatically casts Fox's R-Wing in a silhouette as the camera pans and follows him to rejoin his comrades. The actual movement of the camera is limited, primarily saved for the end of a stage, but it successfully delivered a cinematic quality previously unseen on either the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, at least outside of FMV games, which themselves are quite limited in perspective and scope. The cinematic presentation goes beyond just the camera work. The very opening screen when you power the game on shows Cornerian fighters getting shot down by the massive, imposing sight of the attack carrier, dispersing its dreadful fighters from Venom as the music hums a portent of doom for planet Corneria. Should you then play on the first or second routes, which you are most likely to do when you are playing for the first time, you will be met by the same imposing carrier flying overhead, casting a large shadow as a dramatic theme announces its presence. One of my favorite implementations of this cinematic tone is in the fight against the Great Commander in the penultimate level of the most difficult route. While completely on rails, the player is passing over the great ship repeatedly, having to avoid and deflect its weapons fire while gunning down its vulnerable points. After each pass, Fox will turn back around for another run. It's simple, but up to this point the game had strictly been forward-facing and never turned back. To see them break away from that for the spectacle of a boss was surprising and impressive. Another is when you play through the hard route version of Corneria, and your companion Falco announces that he'll be the one taking on the attack carrier. As the level progresses, the bay, missile launchers, and carrier itself will be lugged away by giant construction bots, letting you know how well Falco's battle is going or has gone. This is just one manner in which Fox McCloud's companions could contribute to the cinematic flair, though many of their interactions are also coupled with gameplay. Their comms was reminiscent of the sort shared in the Star Wars films, again, for the time in 1993, but that chatter could also provide gameplay hints to the player. They'll occasionally fly in to chase enemies of their own, and will reprimand the player should they shoot those foes down instead. More commonly, they'll occasionally fly on screen being chased, and should the player take too long to save them, they'll take damage. 4 hits and that companion will be gone for the remainder of that route. Of course, the real incentive to keeping your comrades alive is that they can assist in downing enemies that manage to get past Fox McCloud. Every stage rewards the player based on the percentage of enemies downed, granting them a continue for hitting certain point milestones. As such, it behooves players to try and achieve 100% enemy elimination, and to ensure better odds, it is best that the player keeps the rest of their team alive. These things may seem minor now, but it was this kind of chatter and watching out for your allies that actually made Falco, Slippy, and Peppy into characters who mattered. It helped to sell the universe to the player, and make it feel like more than just ships blasting at one another. That, and the occasional reptilian pilot flying straight at the player after their ship exploded. As much as I'd love to keep gushing about Star Fox, and believe me, there's still more that I could say, I think it's time I finally address the obvious. As you've watched the gameplay before you on screen, you've no doubt noticed the constant frame drops and unstable frame rate that plagued Star Fox. While Nintendo and Argonaut Software were pushing some serious boundaries in 1993, those boundaries were certainly pushing back. This game can barely manage to hit a consistent 20 frames per second, let alone hoping for 30, and spends most of its time abysmally lower. This interferes with accuracy and precision, but most importantly, it interferes with reaction time, or more specifically, the game's ability to react to player input. If you ever wanted someone to understand the importance of frame rate to an action game, this is the perfect case study, because the mechanic that suffers the most when you need it is the now iconic barrel roll. In order to deflect enemy fire, you need to be able to perform a barrel roll, which requires the player to double tap one of the trigger buttons to execute the maneuver. However, when whole volleys of laser beams and plasma charges are flying your way, potentially in addition to asteroids or other space debris, it becomes difficult for the game to properly register your button presses. This is only made worse if you're desperately trying to fire back at the same time, which you'll need to be firing and rolling simultaneously if you wish to defeat some enemies or take down certain bosses. Which I would say are a bit of a mixed bag. Many bosses are honestly quite simple to defeat. I like the Destroyer since if you try to blast away its cores first, it will actually recover cores, and therefore health lost. Rather than getting more difficult every phase, it'll actually get a bit easier as you take out its components in the correct order. Many of the best bosses kind of work that way, where they'll change phases and become easier rather than more difficult. The attack carrier itself is built on this logic, as is the Rock Crusher and even the Blade Barrier. It's as if the player is rewarded for breaking the enemy vessel apart. However, some bosses are oddly opaque regarding any optimal strategy. The Plasma Hydra, for example, must be shot in its metal claws in order to transfer the damage down to the body. Should an energy pulse already be traveling up its arm though, the metal claw will simply break off. The player is expected to make the connection themselves through the animation in its arms, but the pace of the battle and the focus on the claws means most players are unlikely to really make the connection between when shooting the claw causes damage and when it just breaks off, prolonging the fight. The metal spinner of Macbeth has these massive spheres that are incredibly difficult to evade, with some odd sense of timing as they expand while blades roll above you. Braking and boosting don't seem to impact your odds favorably, so it feels more like a game of luck to avoid the spheres than anything. Of course, difficult to avoid obstacles can be the bane of a few levels. The fireball spitting Hydras and Fortuna will turn their heads and fire at you even after you've flown past them, when you're unable to see the attack coming at all. Even with a level 3 laser, it takes so much to destroy just one head, and attempting to do so often means being a sitting duck to one or more fireballs. The rotating constructs floating about Sector Z are transparent, meaning when you think you're dodging one, you may well be flying into another. Some of the volcanic rocks of Macbeth are more like homing missiles, difficult to time the appropriate evasion of. Worst of all aging mechanics, however, is the double-edged sword of the level 3 twin laser upgrade. While it certainly deals the most damage, it also seems to be the least precise or have some strange hitbox problems. There are several moments where, after saving an ally from a chasing enemy, their R-wing will absorb more of the player's shots than seems reasonable. Try as you might to shoot well over their hull, they're taking that hit. The shots also seem to get caught in geometry rather than blasting away at the enemy you're aiming for, and worst of all, don't always seem to hit their mark on boss weak points. I've had more trouble with hitting my target against the Atomic Core and the Great Commander using the level 3 twin laser than I had the level 2, which has me wondering if it's better overall to just stick to level 2. Those complaints aside, I'd say that the original Star Fox is still a fun, enjoyable game to play. I'd love to say that you stop noticing the horrible frame drops after a while, but it's more accurate to say that I'm used to it since those frame drops are a core memory. Even so, the fun, arcade action and score attacks still get me hooked in, and I really appreciate some of the neat ideas they managed to accomplish when this was still new, albeit limited, technology. I like that Titania begins cold and snow-filled until you deactivate the climate control device, completely changing the color and atmosphere of the level. I still love the sci-fi dogfight theatrics and feeling of invading the space armada to shoot down its enemy vessels, or how every approach to Venom is nothing but Andross sending wave after wave of enemy fighters and rockets your way, like it's a desperate last stand against you and your team. If I'm being honest, I was never able to reach Macbeth as a kid, let alone beat the game on its hardest route, so I was genuinely impressed as an adult to see how they handled a hollowed out world, where enemies could appear on the ground or the ceiling, and where volcanic rocks could drop from above. That camera shift in the Great Commander fight I mentioned earlier, that wasn't nostalgia saying how impressed I was. That caught me off guard as a 41-year-old adult that had never seen that boss before. Star Fox is not aged like fine wine, nor is it timeless, but I don't think it's aged like a dead fish either. It may be rough from a modern lens, but Nintendo's insight into fun and engagement meant they crafted a clever, arcade-style shoot-'em-up where enemies are distinct, the levels have personality, and there's lots of quick, engaging decisions to be made. The question now is, did Star Fox 64 improve upon it? Did it stray away like I had thought? Was it truly the death knell of everything I loved about Star Fox on the Super Nintendo? Well, it's a bit complicated.
We need your help, Star Fox. Andross has declared war. He's invaded...
This is where my memory fails me a bit, as I don't have an accurate recollection of the zeitgeist of the time, at least in regards to Star Fox 64, despite having been just a bit older. The thing is, Star Fox was yesterday's news in terms of technological advancement. The first sequel announced was actually Star Fox 2, and I even remember seeing a screenshot or two of it in Nintendo Power before it was mysteriously never spoken of again. It turns out that, despite having essentially been complete, Nintendo did not feel confident releasing the game to that late 1995, early 1996 console gaming environment. Built upon the more expensive to produce Super FX 2 chip, an evolution of the graphics processor that powered the original Star Fox, it would have driven the cost of the card up enough to seem unreasonable compared to what the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were already pushing. Plus, the N64 was right around the corner. It just didn't make sense to release the game into that market. Honestly, I understand why Nintendo would cancel Star Fox 2, and to an extent, I'm glad they did. I know a lot of people appreciate the game now that it has been released on the SNES Classic, but if younger me thought Star Fox 64 was a step of a departure too far from the original, well, I had no idea just how far Nintendo and Argonaut Software had planned to go. Nonetheless, Nintendo took a few of those ideas from the cancelled sequel and would implement them into what is effectively a reboot on the Nintendo 64. As I said, I have no memory of what the exact or specific zeitgeist around this time was, save 3D graphics were now everywhere. I myself, a loyal Nintendo soldier in the console war against Sega, had become a turncoat and joined the ranks of PlayStation owners instead. While I loved Nintendo and their games, I loved Squaresoft even more at the time. The promise of bigger, better Final Fantasy games lured me away from the empire of the mustachioed plumber. In terms of how Nintendo was marketing and positioning their console, it began with the innovative new analog stick and how it allowed Mario to move around three-dimensional environments. What caught the attention of consumers was the ability to have a 4-player deathmatch right in your living room with GoldenEye 64. As for Star Fox, well, its biggest new selling point would be the Rumble Pack, included with every copy of the game. In hindsight, it's amusing to see how the Nintendo 64 was responsible for 2 innovations in modern controller design and features. I was actually a skeptic at the time, feeling as if I didn't even notice this fancy new Rumble technology after just a few minutes of playing the game. Little did I know it would become a standard and even expected feature in controllers moving forward, used for feedback N with Sony's DualSense controller, an attempt to provide a deeper sense of immersion. For Star Fox 64, however, it just feels so quaint and minor compared to the revelation that Star Fox itself had been. Even if the Rumble Pack was a fun new novelty, it wasn't enough to lure the growing, maturing demographic of players away from the likes of Resident Evil or Tomb Raider. Which isn't to try and paint Star Fox 64 as a failure. In fact, Star Fox 64 outsold the original despite the Nintendo 64's comparative lack of market share to the competition. It's also easy to see why, as by most observable metrics, it's an improvement over the original. The most obvious adjustment is in graphics and performance. Star Fox 64 can actually run at a proper, stable frame rate without the hitches and hiccups that plagued the first game on the Super Nintendo. When you double tap to do a barrel roll, you successfully barrel roll, deflecting all the incoming enemy fire away from you no matter how much is happening on screen. The game no longer needs to add little white dots to convey the illusion of speed, as the far more detailed 3D polygonal graphics speed by in real time, powered by vastly improved hardware. The gibberish bleep bloops that made up the character voice lines in the original game have been replaced by proper voice acting. The cinematic presentation that Nintendo had begun to tease with the very first game was now able to be realized, both in terms of dramatic camera angles and voice performance. Perhaps what is the most interesting iteration of all was changing from a static difficulty route to applying conditions within the different stages to weave between easy, medium, and hard difficulty routes. This means you could start on the easy route, swap to the medium, and then finish on the hard route, still getting the true ending. Or you can start on the hard route, but get knocked back down to the middle or easy routes. To an extent, this is an idea that started in the original game, where players that knew the secret could unlock the black hole in the asteroid belt on the easy route, which would then allow the player to warp to Sector Y on the medium route, Sector Z on the hard route, or straight to Venom on the easy route. It was a bit of a clever skip for skilled players seeking to power up on the easiest level of Corneria before jumping to a harder route, skipping some troublesome stages. In Star Fox 64, however, nearly each planet has hidden conditions or objectives that allow the routes to be a bit more dynamic, driven by either player choice, player knowledge, or player skill. Instead of simply picking a route and reaching the endpoint of each level to progress, how you progress is determined by your own skill and actions. Another adjustment to the original game is the accumulation of points. Due to the sheer number of enemies that can be rendered and positioned on screen, the player is no longer encouraged to get a 100% score, though they are still incentivized to collect as many points as possible. Charging your blaster will result in an area of effect explosion that can eliminate other enemy ships in a formation, which simultaneously adds a bonus to the player's score, in turn encouraging returning players to time and target their charges more tactically and intentionally. Like the Super Nintendo predecessor, the player will be awarded an extra life for each total point milestone hit. However, your comrades will also recover more health at the end of each stage based on your score. This acts as an additional incentive to play more skillfully, trying to group those charged blasts and perhaps utilizing Nova Bombs more often, especially as your allies are more likely to be taking hits, be it due to the new all-range mode missions or the player's own friendly fire, something the first game fortunately did not inflict upon the player. In fact, let's talk about that all-range mode, as it was one of those additions that sounded great on paper, but in execution I was not so fond of when I played as a kid. I can now acknowledge that was largely because I didn't have a handle on the somersault and U-turn controls. I could never recall which button combination was which, and I didn't realize that you could only perform one of those stunts when your boost gauge was full. To really succeed at all range mode missions, you're going to have to learn to bank left and right to tighten up your turns, when to boost or brake, and to definitely master the timing on those somersaults and U-turns. Because I could not, especially as I didn't own the game and therefore couldn't practice, I hated these missions and, in time, grew tired of the versus mode against my friend that had mastered its mechanics. Playing now, I appreciate the all-range missions as a break from the on-rails sections. It feels freeing to fly around the environment trying to shoot down enemy fighters, and I actually wish there was at least one more mission where you would encounter the opposing Star Wolf squadron to take on. They also demand a different mastery of the boost, brake, turn, and aerial acrobatics, keeping the game somewhat arcade in nature while demanding a new kind of mastery to the game and its controls. The problem is that every all-range mission or map is basically a flat plane with some pyramid in the middle, though too much clutter would have no doubt been a problem for players at the time. What I still don't quite appreciate is the Landmaster. I think specifically what I dislike in a Star Fox game is being stuck to the ground. To me, one of the core ingredients to Star Fox's fun is the freedom of movement permitted by flight, which is why the all-range mode no longer bothers me. It's a change in direction from the on-rail shoot-'em-up roots, but it was used sparingly and still allows for a more arcade-style interpretation of aerial dogfight action. The Landmaster, on the other hand, is a bit more awkward to aim and control in comparison, and the levels in which it occupies just feel slow. Perhaps the problem then is utilizing the Landmaster in an on-rails level that begs comparison to how the R-Wing feels and controls. Perhaps it would be better to utilize the Landmaster in different kinds of levels and situations. It turns out, we have a sort of comparison point in the previously unreleased Star Fox 2. If you're not in outer space, you're probably not flying in your R-Wing for very long. Be it the inside of a ship, on a planet's surface, or inside an enemy base, you're probably using the Chicken Walker transformation more to stand on buttons or maneuver around cramped spaces. As expected, it runs and controls rather poorly on Super Nintendo hardware, and I feel it was made too regular a gameplay element. However, I can imagine a universe where the Landmaster was deployed in similar situations where the player had free range of movement but had to navigate environments the R-Wing would struggle with, which is the key point. There's no reason the player needed to use the Landmaster in the levels in which it takes center stage. The player could have easily flown through and accomplished the task more easily and efficiently in an R-Wing. There is no tactical advantage to using the Landmaster in these situations, in universe or in terms of gameplay. The Blue Marine, on the other hand, I was surprised to have enjoyed a bit. They modified the physics enough to feel appropriately like you were moving underwater, with the brake behaving quite differently by halting forward momentum completely rather than simply slowing down. The player no longer has a charge beam, but torpedoes are infinite. If I would make any change, it would be to give those torpedoes a multi-lock capability, as the game still throws groups of enemies at the player, many of whom have phases of invulnerability. It also seems like only one torpedo can be launched at a time, meaning the player lacks optimal defenses against some of these hordes. I feel like I'm going against the grain here, but I think the Blue Marine is a better vehicle than the Landmaster, at least how it's used in Star Fox 64. All that said, the majority of your time will be spent in the on-rails, arcade shoot-'em-up style of missions inherited from the first game, which is precisely what I want in a Star Fox release. I can only imagine my gradual resentment that I built up towards Star Fox 64 was because, as time went on, more and more gameplay styles and features began to decrease that purity of arcade action. Even ignoring Star Fox Adventures, Star Fox Assault, a game I admittedly still haven't played, had moved further away from the R-Wing by emphasizing on-foot combat, again locking Fox to the ground rather than keeping him in the freedom of the skies and space. Star Fox Command on the Nintendo DS was practically a remake of Star Fox 2 in hindsight, and turned everything into an all-range mode dogfight utilizing the stylus as the only control. Star Fox Zero Mission is a story for another day. As time progressed, it felt like the pure, core experience that made Star Fox what it was drifted further and further away, and I pointed my finger at Star Fox 64 as a scapegoat due to the inclusion of all-range mode and alternate vehicles like the Landmaster and Blue Marine. Today, however, going back to truly play and get to know the game, nah man, this game is fun. Those all-range missions are enjoyable once you just buckle down and learn to get good. And even though I think the Landmaster is a weak addition, it's only in, 2 levels? The core of the experience is still intact, and all those deviations in future games were not the fault of this game in particular, but, as is usually the case with Nintendo franchises gone wrong, Shigeru Miyamoto. For now, I do want to do a couple more comparisons to Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, because there are some ways in which I find Star Fox 64 a bit disappointing. The first is that Star Fox 64 feels as if it has fewer levels or planets, even though it's actually pretty close in number. Each route in the original Star Fox has 6 levels, save the hard route which has 7 in total. In Star Fox 64, each route, be they straightforward or more dynamically routed, has 7 levels. In theory, this means Star Fox 64 easily has more levels. The main difference is that Corneria and Venom in the original Star Fox have 3 different variations, not including the approach to Venom, which you could argue is just one level with different bosses and enemies on each route. This effectively means 2 planets contain 6 entirely different levels, whereas Corneria is always the same level in Star Fox 64 no matter what, with 2 separate variations of Venom depending on your concluding path. To me, it feels like there's a greater variety of levels in Star Fox on the Super Nintendo due to the variation of environments and how they pushed the limits of their capabilities to make each world unique. The rocky outcroppings of Meteor, hollow world of Macbeth, flowers and dragons of Fortuna, and the back door to Venom all feel distinct despite the limitations. I don't think the problem is a lack of imagination with Star Fox 64 though. There's a variety of objectives available that you don't get in the first game, such as eliminating every searchlight in Zonus, protecting the Great Fox from enemy missiles in Sector Z, or hitting the switches on Macbeth to redirect the train and skip the boss fight. I think, however, part of the problem comes down to the all-range mode missions. Katina and Fushimi both look very similar to one another, just a flat plane with a pyramid in the center, not unlike the hard route map of Venom. It's understandable why they'd be very similar, especially in an effort to prevent the player from colliding into geometry all the time, but it means 3 of your maps have a very similar feel to them. Only Solar, where you have to fly high to minimize the heat damage to your R-Wing and have to blast molten rock in hopes of shield recovery, and Aquas, where the underwater environment and Blue Marine feel distinctly different from flying with an R-Wing, feel like they implement the kind of unique imagination to the worlds themselves that they attempted in the original Star Fox. Basically, it's a sort of trade-off where you either get distinct worlds or distinct objectives. I will say that I largely enjoy the boss fights more in Star Fox 64 though. I feel like there's a lot more clarity and polish compared to what's on offer on the Super Nintendo. However, there are 2 particular bosses I am not so fond of. The first is the Area 6 boss, Gorgon, or more specifically, the 3 pink energy beams need to annihilate to eventually expose its weak point. As the battle wears on, Gorgon starts moving around erratically, which, in combination with the ping-ponging the energy beams start to do, make it more and more difficult to take out. If you're low on bombs, or your ship loses a wing which makes it harder to fly and drops you down to a single laser, it becomes incredibly difficult to take out all energy beams and deal any damage to the weak point. It's a time-consuming boss that's easy to figure out, but makes it as great of a pain to defeat as possible. If you don't have a double laser at least, just eat an extra life and restart the whole map. Then there's Andross. He kind of stinks in both versions, though for slightly different reasons. That first phase of the fight is easy on both Super Nintendo and N64, though I'd argue even easier on the latter platform once you realize you can stun him with an irritated eyeball. It's the second phase where things change, particularly on the hard mode of Star Fox 64. I get that they want the player to utilize both on-rails and all-range mode skills, but trying to maneuver around this stupid brain is less than enjoyable. I admit to utilizing save states in order to practice and learn this boss, as having to replay the game again and again with very little room to experiment and iterate was less than appealing. Ultimately, I found that you need to study the map, waiting for the boss symbol to almost completely envelop the R-Wing before performing a somersault and evading the tentacles. It's a battle where you have to rely on tight turns in the break to have a hope of shooting the weak spot, but the somersault in particular has to be so particularly timed to avoid getting caught. It doesn't feel like your skills are really being tested, and I'd rather just shoot at cubes again than deal with this brain. As I said though, it's not like the Andross fight in Star Fox on the Super Nintendo is all that great either. The only other complaint I have is for the music, but, well, music is the most subjective of art forms. I always found music to be so grounded in emotion, and there are some feelings that are just difficult to describe that music captures perfectly. The thing is, to me, the main theme of Star Fox 64 sounds like a high school marching band at a football game. The main theme of the original Star Fox, however, is woven through several songs throughout the game. Each of them delivers a sort of emotion to me that just resonates far more deeply. At least, that's how it feels to me. A lot of the soundtrack to Star Fox on the Super Nintendo conveys these weird sci-fi moods, cinematic songs of daring and danger, or heroically piercing the heart of the enemy fortress. In comparison, Star Fox 64 sounds like all of Koji Kondo's songs that weren't good enough for Ocarina of Time. Composer Hajime Hirasawa leaving Nintendo shortly after Star Fox shipped was, in my mind, a great loss to the company. He made one of my favorite soundtracks of the era, and allegedly left over a dispute regarding royalties and soundtrack sales and releases. Nevertheless, my verdict on Star Fox 64 is that it is a worthy sequel to the original. There may still be things I wish it did a bit better, or some things I wish they did like its Super Nintendo predecessor, but this is not the beginning of the end I had believed it to be for whatever reason. It is most certainly a better direction to have gone than the thankfully cancelled at the time Star Fox 2. I am glad to say I was wrong.
Who knows what we'll find out here? Don't lose your focus, Slippy.
A friend of mine recently asked me what I would want in a new Star Fox game. At the time I had a few thoughts, but after revisiting Star Fox 64 and playing Star Fox 2 for the first time, I'm not quite so sure. The latter reminded me of Star Fox Command on the Nintendo DS, a game I haven't played since it was brand new. I never experienced Star Fox Adventures or Star Fox Assault, and I barely remember Star Fox Zero mission beyond how awful the control scheme was. In other words, to get a better idea of what I want, I first need to better understand what hasn't worked. More importantly though, what is it that someone like Shigeru Miyamoto wants? In an old interview, he stated that he originally wanted Star Fox to feature full 3-dimensional navigation. However, not only were they limited by the technology, but he believed players wouldn't be ready for that 3-dimensional shift yet. The on-rails shoot-'em-up gameplay was intended to introduce players to navigating such an environment first, and Star Fox 2 clearly represents the vision to move into full 3D. There aren't any on-rail segments like the first game. When Dylan Cuthbert, one of the original Argonaut developers, pitched a new Star Fox for the Nintendo DS with his new company Q Games, Miyamoto was initially disappointed. It was primarily on-rail shoot-'em-up gameplay, and he was uninterested in pursuing what had already been done. This is why Star Fox Command was so different in structure, and far closer to what it turned out Star Fox 2 had been. Star Fox Zero mission feels like a stubborn endeavor not to make a good Star Fox game, but to prove Miyamoto's two-screen vision was legitimate. What exactly is Star Fox to Miyamoto and the other developers at Nintendo? I think that's what matters in regards to what is next, and why I look at the upcoming Star Fox remake releasing shortly with a mixture of excitement, disappointment, and concern. Personally, I believe this remake is working in tandem with Fox McCloud's cameo in the Mario Galaxy movie to spark interest in the property in younger generations. I believe there is another game, either in development or on Nintendo's minds, intended to follow this remake and be the real next generation Star Fox. But I don't know what Nintendo could be thinking or planning, and I struggle to be optimistic. Nonetheless, I think I want to go through the games that I missed and revisit the games I've since forgotten, especially if I'm going to solidify where I believe the series should go. Will this be the summer of Star Fox for me? It's too early to tell. I'll definitely be playing the remake at the very least. As for what comes after, who knows? At the very least, I've developed a new appreciation for a game I once resented. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.